Lesson 32, Solomon's Kingdom, which is in 1 Kings. You want to turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 3 there. We left off last time. Solomon had taken over the kingship of Israel and Judah, and along with that came some responsibilities that were given to him by his father, and then he fulfilled those responsibilities. He had to put to death Shimei. He had to put to death Adonijah, his half-brother. He had to put to death Joab. And he had to strip from priesthood, or strip Abiathar of his priesthood, so that his kingdom will hopefully be one of peace. It will be one of peace. God has told him it will be one of peace. So Solomon has a majestic and grand kingdom, and we want to see how that kingdom looks like, or what it looks like, before we begin to look at the temple. So we'll see some preparations for the temple, but before we get into the study of how beautiful and big and majestic the temple of Solomon was, we want to also see Solomon's kingdom, how God greatly blessed his kingdom, so he had the ability to do that. So, 1 Kings chapter 3. Starting at verse 1. It says, "And Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house, and the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem round about. Only the people sacrificed in high places, because there was no house built unto the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon the altar. In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream." Whoops, we went over that there yesterday. Where he got... No, we didn't. "And God said, Ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy and truth." No, we did read that. What am I rereading? Well, we won't finish rereading that there, but we didn't read the verse 1, or the beginning part. That's right, we started at verse 5. So, the beginning through verse 4 there. So here's the beginning. Solomon made an affinity with King Pharaoh. Affinity there means an agreement. He worked something out with King David. Or not King David, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Because Egypt was also we know they were a powerful, prosperous nation. They had been before. But Israel had become so powerful and prosperous that the nations around them were afraid of them. They would prefer to make peace with Solomon rather than war. It had been the opposite during David's time. They kept going after Israel, trying to defeat them, trying to go to battle with them so that they could have the riches of the land. And they realized the Lord is on Israel's side. No one, big or small, will ever be able to defeat Israel because the Lord is on their side. So instead, many of the nations around them made peace. This obviously was the Lord's doing. He's trying to establish a time of peace for Solomon so that the nation can grow. The people can finally have a time of rest. They can build a beautiful palace. But we've just studied in devotions, and we heard it in a sermon. What's the trouble of that? Well, the problem with that is people begin to also fall into sin when they begin to live a life of comfort. When they don't have afflictions in their lives, they begin to have an easy life and they trust in themselves and not in the Lord. So, anyways, then we see Solomon sinning in this way. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her in unto him as his wife. Okay? Now, this was not his first wife, so that's what seems to be the issue here. It's not necessarily wrong that he took a wife of Egypt. The Bible doesn't say that that was not allowed. But We don't necessarily know or read whether she was necessarily a godly woman. Maybe she was. But the fact of the matter is, the biggest problem is that this is not his first wife. Okay? Whether she learned to love the Lord or not, we don't seem to know, but obviously Solomon was comfortable marrying her. Okay? And Solomon had to go offer sacrifices, here we read, in Gibeon, because there was really no place for them. There was no tabernacle. There was no temple. The ark was separated from the rest. Remember, it was put up there in a tent where the temple would eventually be built. So the people were offering sacrifices here in strange places, and one of them was Gibeon. Now, jump to verse 16. That's where we should jump to here, because we already read verses 5 through 16. Usually I don't do that again in the future. But anyways, starting at verse 16. Then came there 2 women that were harlots unto the king and stood before him. And the one woman said, O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house. And I was delivered of a child with her in the house. And it came to pass the 3rd day after that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also. So they both had babies. And we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, save we 2 in the house. So there's no one else in the house. I want to make that clear. And this woman's child died in the night because she overlaid it. Or in other words, she slept on top of it. She, in her sleep, rolled over on it and smothered it, and it died. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me, while thine handmaid slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to give my child suck, behold, it was dead. But when I had considered it in the morning, behold, it was not my son which I did bear, or did hold. And the other woman said, Nay, but the living is my son, and the dead is thy son. And this said, No, but the dead is thy son, and the living is my son. Thus they spake before the king. Then said the king, the one saith, This is my son that liveth, and thy son is dead. And the other saith, Nay, but thy son is dead, and my son is living. And the king said, Bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in half. Give half to the one and half to the other. Then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king, so whose it really was, for her bowels yearned upon her son. And she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, Let it neither be mine nor thine, but divide it. Then the king answered and said, Give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. So, the very famous story of Solomon and the 2 women arguing about the child, both of them having young children, one of the children dying while sleeping with its mother, and then it dies, so the mother sneaks to the other bed in the night and swaps the baby so that she can have a living one, even though it's not hers. At least it's living. And then they go before the king, obviously, to bring their complaint to him. And what does Solomon do? Well, he uses wisdom here. God ordained wisdom. He says, this is what we'll do. Let's chop the baby in half. Well, of course, the real mother would rather her baby be alive and in the arms of another woman than to also lose her child too. So she refuses. No. Let her have the baby. Whereas the one who's already really lost her child, she doesn't care about the other one that much. Go ahead, chop it in half. Then she knows they can both be miserable and have lost a child. And Solomon can easily discern, well, the one that wants it to live, even though it's not in her arms, that must be the mother. God had directed this and given Solomon the wisdom here. And that wisdom spread through all the land. Everyone knew about it. What a story. What a wise king we have. And Solomon in his wisdom would say, the Lord has given me this wisdom. I prayed to the Lord. The Lord saw the situation and He told me what to do. At least we can expect a good godly man. That's what he should do. He should not accept the praise for himself, but he must turn the praise and glory to God. Alright, Solomon's prosperous reign. In chapter 4, it starts out that there's many names that were princes over all of the land. But there's a few things that we want to take a look at. Solomon surrounded himself with these captains and wise advisors. He taxed the people of money for money, okay? And they required the taxes not to be paid. Sorry, I said that. He taxed them money. He did not tax them for money, but he taxed them rather for possessions. It was easier probably to give some possessions than it was money. Okay? If I asked you, part your ways with something, would you rather give me a $10 bill, or do you have a little toy or something in your room that maybe was bought for $10 that you never play with? What would you rather give to me? $10 or this toy or trinket that you never even hardly do anything with anymore? Well, most of you say, I'd rather give you the trinket. I'll keep the $10. And so that's what Solomon does here too. He takes food from the people, collects food, and that's how he can feed his whole household, because as we'll see, his household is quickly growing and becomes huge. But if you look at in chapter 4, take a look at verse 22 and 23. We see how great Solomon's kingdom was, or his house was. Just his house. This is food just for his house for one day. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour, and 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep beside harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. That's some of the food that was needed for one day to feed his house. So 10 fattened oxen, and then you got to go get 20 other oxen just out of the pastures that didn't have time to be fattened, and 100 sheep besides. And then you have harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. So fowl would be chickens and birds and turkeys and other things like that, animals, birds. And obviously the harts and roebucks and deer would be types of wild animal like deer. And that's just the meat. Then he's got all of the measures of flour and meal and everything else. That would make about, it's understood today, 30 measures of flour. That would make around 11,000 large loaves of bread today. His kitchens must have been going non-stop. The work must have been endless. Okay? Endless in what he had to do. Okay? And then, so that's just food. What about possessions? What about things that he had? Remember, these are not things that he's jealous of, or that these are things the Lord is blessing him with, because Solomon is a generous man. Verse 26. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and those officers provided victuals for King Solomon and for all that came unto King Solomon's table, every man in his month. They lacked nothing. Barley also and straw for the horses, and dromedaries brought they unto the place where the officers were, every man according to his charge. And God gave Solomon wisdom, and exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman the Calcol, and Darda the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in the nations round about. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts, and of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. Now that one thing there, 40,000 stalls, we would probably say that's probably should have been translated 4,000 stalls, because you have 12,000 horsemen. You have more horses than you have horsemen. Usually was pretty rare. But anyways, the idea is there, that's a huge number. And now he's got to feed all of these animals, and he's got to feed all of these horsemen and soldiers. You can see why. But what's more important, what I think is the most important verse that we need to pull out of here, is that God gave Solomon not just wisdom, but a large heart. When we refer to someone having a large heart, we're referring to their willingness to give. Do you have a large heart? Are you willing to give? Would you be willing to give after you maybe accomplish some tasks, maybe you do some chores for grandpa and grandma, or maybe you work for someone. Do you take of your money, your gifts that you've been given, maybe the money that you've made from a job, maybe you mow someone's lawn, maybe you wash their car, maybe you babysit. Do you take some of that money and turn around and give it to the Lord? Put it in the collection plate? Or maybe there's a financial need. Maybe there's something like the Protestant Reformed special education. Can you give some money to that? Or maybe you hear of another school somewhere that could use some finances. So you send $5 there, $10. It doesn't need to be much. It can be a few dollars here and there. But what we need to do is we need to have a heart like Solomon that's a large heart that gives and gives wholly to the Lord. And we have opportunity to do that. We've said in here, we've had the auction. Can you give of yourself for something like that? Can you have a large heart? So God, we just heard that, we've heard that in sermons too. If I take all of my possessions and keep them for myself, I'm going to probably in the end find myself in dire consequences. The Lord doesn't bless a man who keeps it all for himself. We see the man who built the bigger barns losing his life. Not because he built bigger barns, but because he refused to give it to the people that really needed it. The Lord had greatly blessed him, and he failed to turn around and use those blessings for other people. So we ought to be careful of that too. All right, and then finally some preparations for the temple. Okay. You have to turn to 1 Kings chapter 5. And we'll jump ahead to verse 8 there. We meet a king, King Hiram of Tyre. Okay. In verse 8. So follow along there. And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the things which thou sentest to me for. So Solomon must have sent him a list. And I will do all thy desire concerning timber of cedar and concerning timber of fir. Now, if you know anything about the land of Canaan, although it's a land flowing with milk and honey, it doesn't have necessarily huge forests and trees abundant. So they would send to other places, and one place must have been Tyre. So Solomon must have sent a message here to the king, and he says, yes, I can give you the timber you need. Verse 9, my servants shall bring them down from Lebanon unto the sea, and I will convey them by sea in floats unto the place that thou shalt appoint me, and will cause them to be discharged there, and thou shalt receive them, and thou shalt accomplish my desire in giving food for my household. So Hiram gave Solomon cedar trees and fir trees, according to all his desires, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 measures of wheat for food to his household, and 20 measures of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two made a league together. And King Solomon raised a levy out of all Israel. That's another tax. And the tax was 30,000 men. So he doesn't, again, want money. He wants labor. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by courses. A month they were in Lebanon, and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was over the levy. And Solomon had 70,010 that bare burdens, and 80,000 hewers in the mountains. Beside the chief of Solomon's officers, which were over the work, 3,300, which ruled over the people that wrought in the work. And the king commanded that they brought great stones, costly stones, and hewed stones to lay the foundations of the house. And Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders did hew them, and the stone quarries. So they prepared timber and stones to build the house. God has blessed King Solomon by giving him a neighbor that's a good man, a peaceful neighbor, King Hiram. And they trade. Again, we can see how rich and wealthy, because every year Solomon provides food for King Hiram. His people must live in the woods, probably not a great place to raise a lot of food. So Solomon trades. We have food and wheat. We will give you that. You give us trees. And we see King Hiram doing what men still do today. You cut down the trees and you throw the branches and the big long trunks into the water, and they would float them down through probably the Mediterranean Sea from Tyre to wherever they needed to go, so that they were by the coastline, and then they could maybe up a river or stream or pull them out of the water and carry them and bring them to Jerusalem. So they could do that with these types of trees because cedar and cypress are very resistant to rot very much, although cedar not so much, but cypress would be in that. But he sent those there, and they were traded. And then Solomon needs workers. So again, he doesn't tax the people for money. He says, no, I just need your time. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pick out 30,000 men from Israel. And we're going to divide you into 3 groups of 10,000. So you will go and you'll work for 1 month in the mines and in the quarries and doing everything else, preparing the wood and getting everything. And then you're going to go back to your families for 2 months. And then you're going to go back to work for me for 1 month. And then you're going to go back to your families for 2 months. And then you're going to, and back and forth. So in a full year, you would work for 4 months for King Solomon. But it was much easier on the families and the people if they did it 1 month at a time and then had 2 months off. And then the other group would come in. So the work was constant. Group 1 would go first for a month. Then they would go home and group 2 would come. And they would work for a month and then they would go home. And then group 3 would come and work for a month. They would go home and group 1 would come back. So that you constantly have workers, but you're not wearing them out and keeping them so long from their families that they get tired and complain and grumble. They're going to go back home at the end of the month. And so it works out very well there. So those are 30,000 men. And then there's more and more workers too, probably slaves from the people. And what are they doing? They're cutting out these stones out of the quarries and then taking these large stones and blocks. Really modern marvels, we could say in a sense. We see that, or historical marvels. Today we're just amazed by a crane able to move something. Well, these guys didn't have all the machinery and the cranes. They were doing this by hand. They learned very skillfully how to cut large cubes of stone out of the hills and then carry it so that the stones didn't crack and break along the way. In fact, they're so good at it, we'll see in the future when they're putting the temple together, not a hammer is ever heard there because they can just put them right into place. So they fit perfectly. These blocks that they were taking out were not, maybe a little off here or a little off there, sometimes like we lazily do. Well, it's not quite perfect. No, these blocks have to be perfect so that when they get to the temple, they never have to use a hammer. They just set them in place quietly and silently. And so that the Bible tells us, never was the sound of a hammer heard in the house of the Lord, because they could just set it there perfectly. So to cut a huge block of stone, smooth and straight, it's pretty amazing at what these guys could do. And they did the same with the wood. They're preparing all these things so that when the time comes, they can easily and quickly place together the house of the Lord. So God has given peace and joy and quietness to King Solomon and to the kingdom. That's a beautiful picture because at the end of all times, we will have that too when we go to heaven. There will be a place where there will be quietness and peace and happiness. And by quietness, we don't mean that everyone's silent. By quietness, we mean it's peaceful. There's not trouble and difficulties and trials and sicknesses and fighting and hollering and arguing and jealousy. It'll be a beautiful place where we can sing praises to God. So it won't be silent, but it will be a place in which the things that we do here are peaceful to us. Just like we can listen to a beautiful choir, huge, hundreds of voices, or a band playing music, and we can say, that's peaceful. That brings peace to my soul, those words that they're saying. Not that it's quiet and silent. So God's people are getting a little bit of a picture of that at this time. Solomon's kingdom was one, his rule was one of peace and happiness, and that was good. Alright, so we'll pick up when you guys get back. We won't have a Bible lesson tomorrow because it's not a full day. But you kind of got to remember a few things from